IVM. The United States of America is not an unknown country, even in far-off India, and many of us have grown up in admiration of the ideals and objectives which have made this country great. Yet, though we may know the history and something of the culture of our respective countries, what is required is a true understanding and appreciation of each other, even where we differ. Out of that understanding grows fruitful cooperation in the pursuit of common ideals. What the world today lacks most is, perhaps, understanding and appreciation of one among another nations and people. I have come here, therefore, on a voyage of discovery of the mind and heart of America, and to place before you our own mind and heart. Thus, we may promote that understanding and cooperation which, I feel sure, both our countries earnestly desire. Already I have received a welcome here, the generous warmth of which has created a deep impression on my mind, and indeed somewhat overwhelmed me. Welcome to States of Anarchy. I'm your host, Hamsini Hariharan, and every fortnight on the show, I discuss global affairs and foreign policy with a guest, all in the hope of making a little more sense of the world. What I read out at the beginning of the podcast is an excerpt from the speech of Jawaharlal Nehru to the United States Congress in 1949. Over the last 2 years, the US has become India's most important partner. But things weren't always this hunky-dory. Through the Cold War, for example, the two countries didn't always see eye to eye. So how did we get from being estranged democracies to engaged ones? What have been the major strands in the Indo-US relationship? And what do the recent presidential elections mean for relations between the two countries? My guest for today is doubly special because he's someone I've been meaning to get on the show for over a year now. Dr. Munish Thorangbam is an assistant professor at the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations at the Manipal Academy of Higher Education. He was previously an associate fellow at the Observer Researcher Foundation in New Delhi. He was a South Asian Voices visiting fellow at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C., and also a visiting faculty at the University of Cincinnati, Ohio. We'll get to the conversation with Dr. Munish, but first, a short break.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. It's been an absolutely incredible week on the network. We had so many great guests, so many great episodes. Advertising is dead. We had Faye D'Souza on. Varun took a break for 4 weeks, but what a bang he's back with. Siddharth Deshmukh celebrates the 100th episode of The Traveling Professor. It is an amazing show which I cannot say enough good things about. Please do listen to it. And a different Siddharth on the network, Siddharth Bhatia. He's just been absolutely guest after guest, right? This week, Zoya Akhtar talking about Gully Boy. I couldn't imagine a more interesting conversation. Ragini Kumar is on 2 different episodes this week. She is on Cyrus Says and she is on Edges and Sledges, both in anticipation of her new show, Zindagi Diaries. Do check out her appearance on both of those shows and her new show as well. Tanvi Ashok of The Millennial Athlete had a phenomenal episode with Dinesh Karthik and Abhishek Nair. Absolutely riveting stuff, talking about mentorship in many different ways. Definitely do give that a listen. And finally, I have a request to all of you. We have our listener survey going out this week. Every year we send out a listener survey at the end of the year. We're doing it again this year. And we would really appreciate your help in letting us know a little bit more about yourself. Our advertisers are really keen to find out who is listening to us and more about them. Anything that you could do is kept anonymously, and we would really appreciate your help in this. And to sweeten the pot just a little bit, we'll be giving a randomly selected group of participants in the survey some IBM swag. Last year we gave out coffee mugs. What we're going to give out this year is still a surprise. So please do help us out. Would really appreciate that. And with that, let me get you back to your show.
Munish, sir, welcome to States of Anarchy. I'm so glad that you could join us because this has been an episode that I've been meaning to record since the beginning of this podcast. So I'm very glad you're on the show today.
Thank you, Hamsini. It's my pleasure to be on this platform. And I follow this platform since the very beginning, and I find this platform to be very exciting in terms of the kind of themes that you pick up, the kind of people that you bring in, and my honor to be on this platform.
Thank you. That means so much, particularly coming from you. And for listeners who don't know, the topic that we're talking about today, Indo-US relations, I think I was first mind blown when I sat in your class, maybe it was third semester, and we were discussing Indo-US relations. And there was just so much that I didn't know. Because someone like me who is sort of a post-liberalization kid doesn't really imagine that Indo-US relations could have been anything but warm and fuzzy. And so that, yeah, I think that was a very big turning point for me in my own IR journey, if I may.
Mhm.
So diving into the podcast, when we think about Indo-US relations, as I said, we imagine that India and US are the world's largest democracy, the world's oldest democracy. They have very, very good relations. The diaspora is a big part. Kamala Harris just became, the vice president of the US, and so we can't imagine relations being any way but good. But we know that for a fact the two democracies haven't had a smooth relationship. Can you tell us about how relations were during the Cold War?
Yeah, that's a very important question to ask, and I love to delve more into that because I believe that with all the information and the analysis and assessments that come every time around when there's a US election, uh, I feel that there is, the history is very important to really make a sense of how far this relationship has come. And as you rightly pointed out, if one were to look at the relationship in the last 2 decades, one would assume that this relation should have been good, in the preceding times as well. But it's much more complicated. But having said that, I am also someone who does not really um adhere to the point that this relationship, as someone like Dennis Cox made famous by writing that book on estranged democracies. And a lot of generations, including us, kind of were brought up on this idea that somehow these two democracies did not ever meet in their, there was never a convergence. And so in that, the word itself, estranged, brought in a lot of perceptions and misperceptions about this relationship. And I think a much more comprehensive and a much more analytical reading of history tells you a much more complex relationship, that it was neither estranged nor it was really like convergent. And there were much more complexities. If you were to look at the relationship as two democracies that were destined to be sort of together, but somehow it wasn't, you know. And if you look at even the pre-independent era and see, for example, the US response to the 1943 Bengal famine, or the early expectations from many who were fighting the Indian freedom struggle, that somehow the call of self-determination and the rhetoric of the Roosevelt era somehow chime with India's call for freedom and all those things, we're bound to have some kind of frustration and dissatisfaction of what really came out of that relationship, right? Because that really brings in the problem of structure as well, where you had an Anglo-American alliance fighting the World War II, and it seemed that for Roosevelt as well as for Churchill, you know, specifically for Roosevelt, what was happening with the Anglo-American alliance in terms of fighting World War II was much more of a priority than what was happening in a then India fighting for independence. So you are bound to have dissatisfaction at that level. So this idea that two democracies somehow the value share and all those things were supposed to bring these two countries together somehow did not really work out during the larger phases of the Cold War. But somehow I think it is also wrong to sort of judge or read this relationship merely on the basis that somehow India was with the Soviet Union and US was favoring Pakistan. I think that creates a much more simplistic reading of the history of this relationship. Because despite all this narrative of estrangement between the two countries, you still have a very short sort of thing, born homie sort of a thing happening even in the wake of the 1962 war between India and China. And just a reading of the archives, or even if you read Bruce Riddle's new work on JFK's forgotten crisis, you see that there was indeed an opening where there was even a talk of a long-term military assistance program starting in India, like the way it started in Pakistan with the Mutual Defense Agreement being signed in 1954. And we often sort of forget that the India-US Civil Nuclear Agreement of 2008 is not the first civil nuclear understanding between India and US. The starting of the Tarapur Research Reactor and the Tarapur Power Station dates back to a nuclear agreement between India and United States in 1963. We signed a 30-year contractual agreement in terms of supply of material and other things, which went further ahead with the Tarapur atomic power station becoming critical in 1969. But then we had the 1964 so-called peaceful nuclear explosion, which somehow again brought in a different phase and different dynamic based on this sort of divergence as far as the issue of nuclear energy was concerned. So you do have these instances, like as I said, like the 1962 war opening up this debate about military assistance from the United States. If you were to look just at the larger narrative that we were closer to Soviet Union and Pakistan was closer to US, I think you miss all these complexities of the relationship. That relationships are about countries, not just sort of having this flat sort of a narrative that for 50 years we didn't do anything together. I think that's a misreading of the relationship. And if we misread the relationship in that sense, we somehow also run into the problem of misreading the relationship in the times to come in terms of what we can expect from the United States and what the United States is expecting from us and what is this transaction all about. Because of the Trump period, the word transaction has somehow become a pejorative term in IR. And I believe that it's not a pejorative term. What is IR but transaction? States are transacting, states are negotiating. It's a give and take. It's all a matter of what are you willing and what are you able to transact at that point of time? What is the cost that you are willing to pay for certain choices that you make in your relationships? We made certain choices during the Cold War. The Americans made certain choices. Somewhere they were not aligning because of the choices that were made. And some of the choices that were made maybe brought us closer to the Soviet Union, more spectacularly in 1971. So if the Americans write about India's non-alignment and say that, well, India's non-alignment was a hypocrisy because we went closer to the Soviet Union and signed a friendship treaty with the Soviet Union in 1971, Americans don't write that that same hypocrisy can be applied to when we went closer to them in 62, right? So it's a matter of perspective. If the Soviets were writing about India squandering non-alignment, they would be referring to 1962. And if the Americans were writing about squandering non-alignment, they would be referring to 1971. So it's a matter of like the choices that we made. So, if you look at this relationship in terms of even in, the phase of 1961, it's a byproduct to some extent of the geopolitical flux and the changes that were happening when the Sino-Soviet split happened. And if it's fascinating to read the archives on 1971 or pre-1971, when Henry Kissinger and when Richard Nixon, all of them were more concerned about not about the East Pakistan crisis or not about they were concerned about the war and the refugee crisis, but their concern was more related to the idea that this crisis, which is happening in South Asia, should not distract us from our bigger picture of going closer or, of our rapprochement with the Chinese. So the priority for the Nixon administration was rapprochement with the Chinese. And everything had to fall in place for that. And anything if distracted from the Chinese rapprochement was a distraction for the Americans. And that's why you had this famous sort of a letter written by Nixon to Yahya Khan, the Pakistani military leader during the 1971 crisis. And it's fascinating that when a genocidal crisis was taking place in East Pakistan, and Arthur Blunt and the consulate in Dhaka were writing these telegrams telling the State Department about the crisis that was happening. Here was Richard Nixon writing a letter to Yahya Khan and saying that from now on, when they talk about peace, the world will be in debt to you, right? So You see this, and when people were telling him to do about something about this, the only words that Nixon said was, "Well, don't squeeze Yahya beyond a point." Right? So he was more concerned about that. So in the 80s, for instance, going on from there, we also know, for example, that if in the midst of all this debate of estrangement, many people, I think, overlook the fact that the intelligence agencies, even before the RNAW was founded in 1968, uh, the IV and they had working relationships with the CIA. Post 1962, if you read some of the works, you see that the foundation of what was called as Establishment 99, if I'm not wrong, which later on sort of gets connected to the Special Frontier Force. So the training of the Tibetan exiles and all these things. So you had pretty good working relationships. Uh, you already have some kind of a story about spies in the Himalayas when RNAW and Indian intelligence agencies and and US intelligence agencies together made a mission of tracking the Nanda Devi mountains to put a nuclear engineered, eavesdropping device to eavesdrop on the Chinese military facilities and the nuclear program in the form of what you call as a TECIN, or technical intelligence. So in the and during the Reagan period, you had India and US actually working on a science and technology agreement. You had the Ronald Reagan administration working with the Indian administration in trying to find a way out of supplying nuclear material to India through the French before the French signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1992. So if you look at this history, of course, you had the history of the 79 to 89 period when, despite the Ronald Reagan agreement, signing on a science and tech agreement with India and the relationship not really going through a very rough phase, but at the same time, you had the Afghan war from 79 to 89, and the Americans looking the other way when the Chinese were helping the Pakistanis to get their nuclear bomb, right? So my contention is that the Cold War history has to be, there is much more to explore. There's much more to study, and there's much more to do research on the Cold War. It is so far away from hitting that ceiling where we say that we have understood the Cold War, especially in the context of US strategy in South Asia and in the context of India US relations. I feel that there is much more room for studying the Cold War in all its nuances, in all its complexities, to really sort of dispel perceptions and misperceptions of this idea that somehow you could look at the Cold War in this broad, sort of simplistic narrative that Indians were not with the Americans, Indians were with the Soviet Union, and the Pakistanis were with the Americans, and were with the Chinese. What kind of play was the Chinese doing? If you look at it, post 1965 war, the Pakistanis through Zulfikar Ali Bhutto had started already reaching out to the Chinese, right? So I think that's what I would like to put across, that the Cold War history is much more complex and much more nuanced than we tend to understand, or we tend to sort of portray it. And I think that complexity has to be understood in order to understand what we can expect from this relationship in the times to come, and what we should not expect from this relationship in the times to come. And I think that's really important.
So would you say that instead of sort of subscribing to these broad narratives or of, India was estranged with the US, India was siding with the USSR, we should study it transaction by transaction? Is that a better approach?
I think studying the broad picture, of course, is important, right? Having a broad narrative really sort of like picks people's mind in terms of looking at it from the broad direction of where the relationship was going. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that I'm not saying that it's really wrong to say that the relationship was estranged in some ways. It was in some ways, right? Uh, but to really sort of like downplay the other side, which is that uh, if we say that the two countries never really tried to work with each other, or there were not openings of opportunity somewhere, which were because of the structural structure of the Cold War, of bipolarity and our own non-aligned sort of standing, and also the dynamic geopolitics of interest-driven geopolitics in Asia and other places, somewhere these opportunities could have been more sporadic in nature rather than being sustainable, right? So the opening of 1962, for instance, was somewhat sporadic in the sense that it did not take much time to really sort of move into a more, let's say, a phase which many still call the nadir of India-US relations, when the USS Enterprise came, sail into the Bay of Bengal. But not many people talk about the fact that when the 1962 war was on its height, which was a very short war by any measure, there are reports which says that there were signals which were sent for a US aircraft carrier to come to this side of the world, but this time not against India, but in support of India, right? So, you have two different instances of US aircraft carriers being called to this part of the world. Uh, and in 62, it just happens to be in support of India. And in 71, it just is seen as a way as a scare tactics towards, to aim at India. So uh, it is important to have a broad picture, but I think much more work needs to be done in terms of, picking out these momentous phases in the relationship, and then see as to how they would contribute in terms of having a relook at the relationship in all its complexity, right? There are good works done, but there is much more, I think, room for work to be done, let's say, on each of these momentous phases, whether it's the 70s or it's the 60s or it's the 80s, right? So you would have books which looks at, let's say, U.S.-India relations post-Cold War or Cold War, or how it has developed over the years. Somewhere I think it's also important to have works which looks specifically at momentous phases, and see what is the contribution of that phase to understanding this relationship in a much more, let's say, nuanced way. So it has to be both. There will be people who would look at the big picture, the big geopolitics, ship of geopolitics, and how the change in the geopolitics sort of affected the bilaterals. But I think there should also be a lot of work which looks at how each of these sort of phases played out, right? We know much more about Cold War in the European theater than we know about Cold War, as some author called Cold War on the periphery. It's a good theme, and I'll come to that later on. It's a good theme to say Cold War on the periphery, but I have been questioning it myself, that was South Asia really on the periphery when it came to Cold War? Or it's just a matter of like, where do you look at it from, right? We were at the heart of the Cold War. The moment the Americans signed the mutual defense agreement with the Pakistanis, and American arms and ammunition started flowing into Pakistan, right? So I think those kind of narratives either has to be affirmed depending on your research, or either has to be challenged and new narratives have to come forward, for instance, of how this part of the world really features in America's worldview, and also how America featured and continues to feature in our worldview, because that's really a game of expectations at times, where you have a United States which is globally engaged, and you have a India which has normative global expectations and normative global aspirations, but in terms of material influence, in terms of material contribution and other things, we were perhaps more regional in nature, sub-regional, regional in nature. So what America expected from India in its own Cold War games, and how what India expected out of United States in the early phases of the Cold War and as the Cold War developed, I think that has to be really understood in terms of the asymmetry in terms of our aspirations and expectations, and how this really played out. So I think it has to be both, like, people looking at the broad picture, as well as people who are looking at specific phases and specific eras, specific presidencies, specific prime ministers, uh, and when those come together, I think it will give a much more sort of a wholesome picture of the relationship, right?
That makes sense. And I think what we can agree on is that things changed with the end of the Cold War. Things changed when India liberalized. And to a lot of people, that seems sort of a turning point in the relationship, not only with the economic relationship, but then what happens when India does its second round of nuclear tests. So, why would you say this was such a big turning point?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Uh, well, I mean, one thing we can agree upon is that there is a dramatic shift in the structure, and I assume a dramatic shift in how India was looking at the world in terms of the new world order at that point of time, which somehow wasn't bipolar. And if the other pole had fallen down, the assumption was that it's unipolar. Um, and certainly it had not entered into the phase of like the China rising thing, and then the debates on multipolarity is at least like 15 years away, right, from that point of view. So I believe that that must have been a very for the loss of words, let's just say that there would have been a strategic flux at that point of time, and there would have been a kind of intention to sort of like look at the world differently, and also a realization that there need to be a change in how India looks at partnerships. India looks at foreign policy choices, and I think the effect was there on the American side also. In terms of at least what you mentioned as the economic opening in India and the economic liberalization, and by the early 90s, you have the Commerce Section Agency of the US government coming out with reports which puts India as one of the big 10 emerging markets of the world in the new era. And also, you have a lot of things happening during the 90s in terms of American companies sort of looking towards India as a market, and India also sort of like entering a new phase where both the broad direction as well as the specific mechanics of policy making from an economic point of view and how multi agencies work in that country was also undergoing a lot of changes in terms of adapting to the economic transformation and adapting to a new world altogether. So I think it's a very interesting time in which Bill Clinton sort of comes into the presidency. There is only a one term period of George H.W. Bush, so, and a very important conflict again, which happens as a part of Gulf War One, and there was even a instance where there was apparently a refueling of an American plane in the Sahar airport in uh, Maharashtra, Mumbai, and that did not sustain because of political opposition from India. So I think it's a beginning of a new era in America in terms of how Bill Clinton came in and at least one intended to, in rhetoric and in public sort of a thing, to give an economic turn to American foreign policy. And India was certainly looked at from certain areas as a country which was important from that point of view. Much more in the terms of potential than really realization at that point of time. But yes, you really see this change in what you say as the interagency process of foreign policy making in the United States, where you begin to see, let's say, the Commerce Department starting to look at India differently and also intending to approach India differently. And also the influential sort of consortiums in the US companies starting to look at India differently. So I assume that that was having an impact on how India featured in America's worldview, right, in the post-Cold War era. But that was not the only thing, as you briefly mentioned. Non-proliferation, non-proliferation issues was a big thing during the Clinton administration. In fact, there was this famous line of rolling, capping, and eliminating India's nuclear program. So the Clinton administration somehow started, at least from India's point of view, on a wrong note with a very uh, hawkish views on non-proliferation in his administration, and many reports have pointed to the role of CIA's eavesdropping in terms of preventing India from going towards a second nuclear test much before 98, right? So this was indeed a thorny issue. But the other important part is also to look at important visits like Narasimha Rao's visit to the US, and then there was a big team of the Commerce Department headed by Ronald Brown who came to India. Also on the economic point, a lot of things was happening. Clinton administration also had a couple of personalities like Robin Raphael, who at some point questioned the instrument of accession of JNK to India. So there were a lot of, let's say, wrong notes, which actually gives ammunition to a very important debate in India that the Republicans are better for India as compared to the Democrats. Maybe I can, elaborate on that later. What is my own view of that? Because it's a very pervading kind of a debate. Everywhere from IR people to outside IR people to embassy, this thing and news people. I think every time an election takes place in US, this is the first question we ask ourselves that Republicans are better or Democrats are better. I'll come to that later on. But I'm trying to say that the non-proliferation issue, the Kashmir issue, many of these things, I think also led to this debate about who is better and all those things. So the important point for the Clinton administration as far as the India-US relations is concerned is this question. And I haven't really arrived at a particular answer for this, but I think it's an important question to put across, which is that when we had a 1998 test, of course, I believe that sanctions is American default policy. So you don't know what to do, you put sanctions. Okay, it's like a default tool in the toolkit of American foreign policy. It's like someone behaves a little differently from what United States expects that country to behave, and they don't know how to respond or react. And the first thing they put is sanctions. So I think it was quite apparent, or it was quite clear that sanctions were coming. I think when the Indian administration, the Indian leadership went ahead with the 1998 Pokhran test, I believe that they would be knowing already that the first thing that is going to come is sanctions on India, right? And I think that must have been debated quite frankly and quite openly within the Indian leadership when they would have talked about such a thing like the Pokhran test, that technological sanctions are going to come and other kinds of sanctions are going to come, like the entity list, which was started. And perhaps it also happens that when Americans put sanctions, they come back and then remove the sanctions on agriculture and other human, related issues. Quite like they will put a sanction and then they will come back and remove those sanctions again to project this idea that here is a benign country, benign power, which will put sanctions, but which will not let people of that country be affected by those sanctions. So it's a part of their public diplomacy. So it happens. So when you put those sanctions and then you have a couple of other countries, like Japan reacted quite harshly to, quite, I think, expectedly. So you immediately had this, this immediate sort of an impact, which seemed to pull down the relationship a few notches below, right? But the most interesting thing is, how long does it take the Clinton administration to come around and give an embrace to India? Not years. Within 3 years, we are talking about this shift, right? So in 98 May, you had the test and you had this whole thing of like sanctions and other things. But by 99, by very quite early, you had the Kargil war. And then the most significant outcome of the Kargil war in terms of diplomacy has been this story of Nawaz Sharif sort of rushing to Washington, D.C. and asking for American help. And Clinton sort of telling Nawaz Sharif that you guys started it, you guys will pull out. So, in terms of that thing, it was known as the Americans calling a spade for the first time. So, I think it doesn't take long. So I think you need to ask this, that within a matter of year, how does this sort of shift happen? And you also had perhaps one of the most significant sort of CBMs in terms of India-US, in the sense that the nuclear test and the sanctions, like was immediately followed by the talks between, Stop Talbot and Jaswant Singh, which is quite in detail laid out by Stop Talbot in the book called Engaging India. So here you have two countries trying to engage each other at the very high level and having 14 to 15 round of talks in different countries around the world, including number of diplomats from India and from US. And so right after the test, you have these two countries talking about the thorniest issue in their relationship, which is the nuclear issue. So in terms of negotiation thinking or literature, it just boils down to this, chicken and egg story about like, do you start a negotiation by picking on the easy things and then hoping that when you arrive at convergence on the easier things, you must have developed some kind of understanding to pick the difficult things? Or was in this case taking the bull by the horns, where we decided that we're going to handle the most difficult issue in this relationship. We're going to try to, walk apart and come at a path together, even if though we might not agree on everything. We haven't signed on the NPT, right? The Americans haven't ratified the CTBT. We haven't signed the CTBT at all. So there are a lot of issues that we don't sort of like, converge. Maybe we're walking parallel, we're not converging. But somewhere I think the Jaswant Singh Talbot talks were pretty monumental in terms of high level talks on some of these most strategic issues, which were difficult issues in this relationship. And I think once they did that, they sort of paved the way for other things to follow. Right. So you have a 98 days, but you have a Jaswant Singh Talbot talks. You have a US showing a different face to Pakistan and India during the Kargil war. And then in the March of 2000, you have Clinton coming for 5 days to India in what is perhaps one of the most successful visits in terms of diplomacy, in terms of the optics as well as the substance. He stayed for a few hours in Pakistan, and that's a big change, right? So I think it was more than, if I'm not wrong, since Jimmy Carter, none of the American presidents had visited India. So it was almost 2 decades later, or more than 2 decades later, that an American president was visiting India, not on like a one-day visit, hopping from Pakistan to India, but on a 5-day visit to India, and really sort of at the very fake end of his tenure, Clinton sort of being credited with turning the new leaf in the India-US relationship. Although for a much longer period of his administration, he was known not very favorably in Indian circles, in Indian policy making and strategic community. But then, really, the second term, starting from the nuclear test up to the Kargil war and then the 2000 visit, I think what in my mind is that beginning in the post Cold War era, both from New Delhi as from Washington, I think there was already an intention to move this relationship on a different path. There were choices being made in Washington as well as in New Delhi that these two countries need to come, and that the structure provides that prudence for these two countries to come together. The New World Order allows these two countries to take a different path and sort of put some of the hesitations of history, as they call it, behind. And that journey was already started. What came in the form of the test, nuclear test, and other things, I think was a sort of a roadblock, a road bump and a speed breaker. But because the journey of a new direction had already started by then, I think that speed breaker was not allowed to break the speed for a very long time. And somehow the two countries found a way to sort of like put the relationship on that path once again. And I think that's what the 98 2000 period really shows in terms of the post-Cold War and the Clinton administration, and also the change of administrations in India itself.
That makes sense. And it also makes me wonder about the Bush years in that sense, because a lot of people assume that Obama had wonderful relations with India. But a lot of this was possible because of what happened through the Bush years. And it's also very interesting because, George Bush Jr. is someone who is ridiculed a lot at that point in time. He's very, let's say, meme worthy content. But it was during his tenure that you had things really pick up in the relations between the two countries. Isn't that right?
That is right. And the Bush years also added to, again, our understanding, as I told earlier, that the Republicans are better for India. You know, so it's an interesting thing, and that adds up to what I was telling before about studying specific presidencies and their contribution to the relationship. Uh, and to really sort of when we say for now that India-US relationship has that enviable position of having a bipartisan support in Washington D.C. What does that really mean? When we continue to have this debate of which party is better for India, on the one hand you have this understanding that it has a bipartisan support. In that sense, this debate doesn't it's not relevant for me, which is that which party is better, right? So, and I think the Bush administration or the Bush years had some role to play in terms of the positives that happened during that term. And as I think you rightly hinted at, the India-US relationship flourished at a time when there was a growing anti-Americanism in many other parts of the world because of the Iraqi intervention and, the falling popularity of Bush himself in the United States and other parts of the world. So I think it is a very, very important and a very interesting 8 years in this relationship, and it needs much more thorough study. Even from you know, people used to often debate that like Bush somehow had an instinctive liking for India, despite not being someone who seemed to have a very good sense of foreign relations or the outside world, right? So you can have debates on about like where that instinctive liking came from. This also could be understood or explained perhaps in both the structure as well as the role of the leadership as such, right? So even in India, I think during the Bush administration, you had both the BJP spearheaded NDA, and then towards the later period, you had the Congress spearheaded UPA, right? So I think even in India's case, also you have, although we are not a bi-party system, but you already see that the two biggest parties in national parties in India also seem to have developed some kind of a bipartisan sort of a thing. And when it came to India-US relationship, because uh, in both the United States and India, with somewhat differences of like the change of administration, but the larger direction of the relationship has been more or less, in my mind, like a relay race. Like someone passing the baton to Manmohan Singh, like Vajpayee passing it to Manmohan Singh, and despite all the differences of style between Manmohan Singh and Prime Minister Modi, somehow the baton is somehow passed to Modi also, and he has taken it forward, right? And I think the similar thing has happened in terms of the last years of the Clinton sort of a thing, passing the baton to Bush administration, and somehow, despite early hesitations, the Obama administration also coming around and then pulling across the baton, and that really, and despite all the uncertainties and all the cruel jokes that we have on President Trump, somehow that man also and his administration in this relationship at least has really taken the baton forward, right? So you see that thing happening on both the sides. From the structure level, I think it's really interesting that even during the campaign time when Condoleezza Rice, who later on became the NSA and the Secretary of State, who was a foreign policy advisor for the campaign, along with people like Donald Rumsfeld and others, wrote an article in the Foreign Affairs the Foreign Affairs, as you know, usually carries article while the campaign is going on, right? So I think it was in 2000, she wrote an article, and in 2000 that was quite interesting how she wrote about if India is in the calculations of China, for instance, and if China is the big thing that's happening for us. Now, so by this time, the China rise debate has really caught on, right? So the kind of debate that you're having in DC right now about who accommodated China and led China to rise the way it has risen, right? So that debate has really gone on in the 90s, China coming into the WTO, all those kind of things. So by 2000, by the new turn of the new millennium, you really have this China specter sort of somehow starting to lurk in American strategic minds, right? So you have someone like Condoleezza Rice talking about the China challenge and writing that Washington has a way of looking at India through the India-Pakistan lens. And she argues that it's high time we look at India in terms of what role it's going to play in the China challenge angle. Right? So this is 2000. So in the turn of the new millennium, you have someone like Condoleezza Rice, who is very much an insider when it comes to American foreign policy making. At least in the Republican setup, right? Not in the Trump setup, but otherwise in the Republican establishment. So you have someone like Condoleezza Rice talking about things like this, and the Bush administration coming into the office, but somehow distracted by the 9/11 attacks, right? So, in terms of grand strategy of the U.S., and this is a kind of an argument that I've been thinking about, which is that I don't think that when the Bush administration came, at least the foreign policy team and the strategic minds in the administration, I don't think that it was a part of American grand strategy to battle Islamic terrorism. It has been a problem for the US, right, from before. But I don't think they were sitting down and then hatching a plan to launch this global war on terrorism. So if you were to look at American grand strategy in the turn of the new millennium, I would figure that China featured quite prominently in that, right? But somehow you could argue that the global war on terrorism distracted American resources, American priority, American policy bandwidth uh, for many years, right? And it takes Obama administration till around 2011 to come around and start talking about the Asia pivot, right? So for almost a decade, you have American resources and American policy bandwidth sort of being distracted with the wars in Afghanistan and then in Iraq. And then there are arguments now that says that that phase allowed the China to be the China that it is now, right? So I think from a structure thing, there was a structural convergence. There was a geopolitical convergence that if there was a case of America countering hegemony, right, in some sense. And it's very interesting that if you look at the Shanghai Communique of early 1970s, which Richard Nixon signed, there is a particular a particular provision or a statement in the communique which says that US and China, the PRC, are going to work together to prevent the rise of hegemony in Asia Pacific. 70, and then now you see, right? So, that's the stuff of geopolitics, right? So certainly they were talking about the hegemony of the Soviet Union at that point of time, and the Chinese and the Americans were going to come together, right? The same Chinese, the Americans were wanting to sort of contain as communist baton of the Soviet Union. So fast forward to the 21st century, America still wants to counter hegemony in the Asia Pacific and in the so-called Indo-Pacific, but it's the Chinese with whom they were planning to work together to contain hegemony is constant. The actors might change, right, over a period of time, and that really happened. Now, in this new framework of countering hegemony, of who is the competitor or peer competitor or whatever you call it, and who are the other probable partners and choices that America is going to make. Somewhere India started featuring very prominently, and the team that Bush brought in, right, had a number of this kind of strategic minds uh, for whom India started featuring very prominently in this whole China challenge thing. So I think there was a structural convergence in these two countries sort of coming together. And that really led to new understandings of next steps in strategic partnership, or the joint statement of July 18, 2005, in which United States called India as a responsible country with advanced nuclear technology. Right. So more emphasis on the responsible part, that it's the same Americans who has come around in that sense. Right. So I think there was a structural convergence which allowed these two countries to behave in the way they did. And I think that thinking was not only from Washington, it was also from Indian side, in terms of you know, sort of really re-looking at the strategic landscape in Asia, and then rethinking our partners, and rethinking the foreign policy choices that we are going to make, and also rethinking, okay, what are the consequences of these choices that we are going to make, right? So I think in Delhi also during the Bajpayee administration, the strategic thinking is going that side. So that's why you have these monumental negotiations on the India-US nuclear agreement sort of starting. I think if you look at the tangibles, there's nothing, right? We haven't got a reactor. I don't know if the Americans were really serious in selling us reactors in the first place, or my thinking is that in terms of tangibles, in terms of getting reactors or anything, that hasn't really happened. There are, of course, a lot of issues on that, Civil Nuclear Liability Act, all those things. But what I'm trying to argue here is that, in my mind, the nuclear agreement is not important for what you are getting or not getting in terms of reactors and other things. Uh, for someone who looks at this relationship and the broader picture of this relationship, I understand it that the nuclear agreement is a fantastic confidence building measure between the two countries, right? So you haven't got anything on that, but the two countries haven't had a sweaty forehead because of that. You know, like we really haven't. We have not been going at each other. Why the reactors haven't come? Why you are doing this? Why somehow it features in the joint statement every time that we have working groups. We are working on it, and somehow it's kept like that. But that makes me somehow think that it's not really about the reactors, right? It's really about the fact that uh, more than ever before, like in the way that it had never happened in the history of this relationship, the bureaucracies of the two countries came together in order to negotiate this particular agreement. And imagine the number of rounds and frequent flyer miles that these guys must have done in terms of talking about this agreement, right? There is a book by Anya Manuel about India, US, and China, where she was she talks about the negotiation part, and she says that uh, the the Americans have a way of sort of pushing across, like, okay, these are the 10 points, or these are the provisions that we want to negotiate. And she kind of says that we somehow learned that that's not the way to start with Indians. If you put that across to Indians and it sounds like a fait accompli, then the Indians will become a harder negotiator. So it's like, okay, the point is negotiating with Indians or India is that you develop a broader rapport over cups of chai over and over again, right? And then once you have developed that general broader rapport, then it becomes easier to negotiate, and then enter into some kind of a more positive negotiation, right? So I believe that uh, imagine the number of times American bureaucracies and American leaderships would have communicated to each other for getting the waiver at the nuclear suppliers group, despite the Chinese sort of roadblock, right? And what it does, I think, it builds a habit of cooperation between the two countries, right? It builds that institutional linkage somehow, which was sort of missing before. And I believe that that institutional linkage is what has really brought about this sort of reliability or a greater reliability or a greater sense of stability in the relationship. That it doesn't really matter who comes to the White House or if there is a change of guard in India. Like, you know, if there was a lot of apprehension when Prime Minister Modi won elections, but that did not take for long those apprehensions to be set aside, and then for the broader aspect of the bilateral relationship to take over, in terms of the continuity of the convergence, right? So I think the nuclear agreement and the negotiations that were had really build that habit of cooperation, not only in the political leadership, but more specifically in the bureaucracies, which outlives political leaderships, right, in both the countries. And uh, I cannot say this with certainty, but I believe that in the corridors of power, in the Congress and in the Indian Parliament, and in the many agencies, at the NSC or the Defense Department or the Commerce Department or the State Department, in our case at the MEA or the MOD or many of this, like look at the kind of convergence which is there between the two militaries. It's unthinkable, some decades before, right? So I think uh, there has been a shift. It doesn't mean that there are no hesitations. There will be, as in any relationship between two big countries with big bureaucracies. Uh, but if there were voices in the corridors of power in DC who were very critical of India or this relationship, if there were voices in the corridors of power in New Delhi who were really sort of like, could not hear about a US India strategic partnership or anything, I think over the years, somehow those voices have been overwhelmed by voices which talks about greater partnership between the two countries. You still talk about the hesitation part. You still talk about, okay, what can work and what cannot work. What can we expect, what cannot we expect in both the countries, not only in India, but also in DC. But I think that presumption from even starting, that even before you start talking about a partnership, you already presume that the Americans are trying to, make use of you, or that the Indians will be at the receiving end of American geopolitical sort of dynamics and other things. I think somewhere that has dissipated to a large extent. Even the voices which are critical now are more about like, how do we negotiate in a way that we can get more for the promotion and protection of Indian interests, rather than really jumping the gun before you start anything and say they're nothing doing with the Americans, right? So I think that has dissipated in our part, and I think in the Congress as well as in the American institutions, I think that has also dissipated to a large extent. And in that sense, I think the Bush administration, uh, despite all his unpopularity on other areas, really will be remembered whenever the history of India-US relations is written. The Bush administration will always be written in golden letters, right? Let's just say that way.
Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense because when I think about relationship with any country, right, you have sort of three pillars, which would be sort of what is the structure of the world or the context in which your relations are taking place, what are maybe values that you and the other country share or don't share, and what does leadership do. And as you rightly pointed out, the fourth prong is bureaucracies fostering habits of cooperation. And that's sort of an important cog that we miss out often when we think about relations between India and the US. And I think, a constructivist would say that it's these ideas and these cooperative habits that really form the bedrock of relations. So moving on from Bush to Obama, do you see change or continuity? Something that I remember reading about is that every time the US wants to invest in Asia, whether it's Bush, whether it's Obama announcing sort of a pivot to Asia, they always become hostage to their policy in the Middle East. And that's something that sort of pervaded American foreign policy. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of people argue that China has risen the way it has risen, because America hasn't really been able to focus on its policy in Asia. What do you think of that?
As I said, about the Cold War period also, as a country, at least with the starting of sort of a sense of globalism in U.S. foreign policy after the end of World War II, um, there is a certain way in which America has went about or gone about sort of building this structure, the financial order as well as the security order, right? Security order based on alliances and other things, and financial order based on the Bretton Woods systems and other things. So I think with changing of structure and with changes in American domestic, let's say American political sort of responses to those changes, uh, there was bound to be this what you call as like times when American resources and attention seems to be stretched, and it is not new. This has happened before also, right? Just to take an example from the Asian continent, when the Americans were really knee deep into the Vietnam quagmire, all sort of records shows that, for instance, the Lyndon B. Johnson administration was really sort of wanting to somehow not do too much about South Asia, even as there was a war between India and Pakistan in 1965, because the priority for US was Southeast Asia, the Vietnam War. So I think it doesn't mean that the Americans were not involved. There were a lot of things happening in Europe as well as Middle East, what we call as West Asia, at that point of time in different parts of the world. So it's not like the Americans were in Vietnam and they were not anywhere else, right? You have around the same time, uh, let's say you have the June War happening, right, 1967, and around the same time when the Americans are sort of coming out from Vietnam and signing these agreements to sort of like withdraw from Vietnam, you have Yom Kippur War again in 73, and the Arab sort of oil crisis and all those impact on the economics of it, right? So at every point of time, I think for a power like the United States, and I believe that will be the case for any future power as well, whose resources and whose attention are global in nature, right? It really depends on what your aspirations are. That's where there is this great debate in American strategy or grand strategy every time about being either isolationist or interventionist or protectionist, right? Some would say it's protectionist, not isolationist, right? And if you look at the four schools of American foreign policy that Walter Mitty talks about, Jacksonian, Hamiltonian, Wilsonian, So uh, if you look at all of this, this trance of American foreign policy is it's not recent. There are many times during the Cold War when American resources have been called into question that why are you going there, either from the domestic scenario or either in terms of how America projects itself internationally also. So it's a question of like if America or any other country decides that our aspirations are very limited from now on, and we are going to deal only with the European affairs or only with the American affairs in the North and the South America, not so much the South. Let's say if the Americans really retrenches itself, right? Then it will be a different question altogether. But despite all the decline debate, despite everything, I don't think there are really great signals that Americans are really interested in isolating itself or retrenching itself. It is more a question of like this bush and bum of like American economic debate and other things, right? So whenever there are body bags arriving, sorry to use the word, but that's what they use, right? So there are whenever there are body bags arriving, whether from Afghanistan or whether from Iraq or whether from Vietnam, they are going to be domestic a situation in America in terms of from the Congress and in the streets sometimes, right? When it becomes more volatile. Whenever there is a economic crisis, a big economic crisis or small economic crisis, America has gone through a number of economic crises, some of which we study, some of which we don't, right? So we lastly study the Great Depression and then the 2008 financial crisis. It doesn't mean that America did not went into an economic problem like in between this or before that. So whenever there has been economic issues at home, this whole idea of bread and butter versus guns, always arises in American policy making and debate. And I think after 2008, this debate again started because of the financial recession. And around that time, you had a lot of American books from think tanks coming out, which were named, like Michael Mandelbaum from Brookings wrote a book called Frugal Superpower.
Mm-hmm.
So he is arguing about the frugality of superpower dome, right? How you can still be a superpower by being frugal. So the idea of like doing more with less, no? How can you do more with less, right? So, so the question is not really about like, oh, there is an America now which wants to retrench itself, which wants to isolate itself, and which doesn't want to do anything with like things great power. I think that has never been the debate. America has never expressed that, despite the debate about they wanting to share burden, they wanting other regional countries to take up regional matters, they wanting not to engulf themselves too much in regional problems because of the reverses suffered in the Middle East, right? So you have this kind of debates. You have a NATO burden sharing debate, which is not a Trump era debate. It used to happen during Obama also. It's just that Obama did not line up his partner countries and then give it to them in the style of Trump. Maybe he did it in a much more diplomatic fashion, right? Maybe Biden will do so again, maybe in a much more diplomatic fashion, not in the style of Trump.
Mm-hmm.
But it is not a Trump debate, this idea of burden sharing, right? So you have in the post 2008, you have these ideas of frugal superpower. You have Richard Haas from Council on Foreign Relations writing that nation building is at home, So you have a couple of, it's a thematic thing that appeals to the times, right? So right after 2008, those themes appealed, that nation building is at home, bring our troops back, you know, don't put no longer this $1 trillion wars. What did we get out of it? Then the question about, okay, where is the party really going on? And the party is going on in Asia Pacific, right? In terms of economic growth, and in terms of looking at, okay, who is going to be the next guy, right? With whom I am going to play this like elbowing game, right? So, and it happens to be China. So, and it has been China for some time. It's just that they were engaged somewhere else, right? So, I think there is a periodic sort of a sense whereby the Obama administration understands the pulse of the times, in the sense that he already started campaigning as like, okay, I'm going to fight the war of necessity in Afghanistan and then end the war of choice in Iraq, right? So that war of necessity is really going on till now, right? So and that war of choice in Iraq has morphed into some other kind of war altogether, wherein the Americans are still involved in some ways or the other, not in the ways it was before. So the point is that they caught the pulse of the time. It was like time to go back to the great power debate again, right? When you are fighting terrorists in different parts of the world, you are not in a great power debate, right? You're really trying to sort of put out fires which you feel can engulf your own home at certain point of time, right? So it's not a great power debate in some sense. The great power debate somewhere dissipated during this decade. Somehow, when in 2011 Hillary Clinton started writing about America's Pacific century, and you say that, okay, the future is Asia, the future is Asia Pacific. Where are the Americans? The Americans have been always a part of Asia. It's like a shift of priorities. And the Americans want to be a Pacific country in the Asia Pacific century. So they want to sort of like, when I was just entering Google Meet, there was a option which says blur your background, right? So, so I was just, I was just thinking that the Americans just wanted to blur the Atlantic theater a little bit, and then sort of like focus on the Pacific theater a little more, right? So it is not like uh, at that point of time, not so much now, but at that point of time when the Asia pivot thing started, there were a lot of articles from Europe, like, okay, are the Americans leaving this theater, this and that, right? And then there were counter articles which says that the Americans and the Europeans are going to go together into Asia Pacific or Indo Pacific, right? So I think that's the point when there is a sort of like people start playing up this Obama ties to Indonesia, having lived in Indonesia, and then saying that the first Asia Pacific president in the US, right? So um, so from a much more cultural sort of a point of view, that but it's that time when America sort of like steers um, the direction in a certain way and starts talking about the 60-40 split of forces and other things, and starts talking about China's anti-access and area denial capabilities and strategies, and starts talking about the ERC battle concept and all those things. So I think there is a much more of like a continuity, at least in the India-US relationship, in the sense that it really takes forward the strategic dimension of the relationship about the future of Asia Pacific or Indo Pacific, and what is going to be the nature of this partnership. And despite earlier hesitations, again, where Obama went to China, and then I think that he made some comments about China playing greater role in South Asia, and as always, we got really angry with that. And this debate again started of power condominium and G2 and the new great power relationship. But somewhere, I think Hillary came in 2009 and did this public diplomacy sort of extravaganza of 5 days or something going around India to really set the grounds for Obama's visit, I think, in 2010, his first visit where he spoke in the joint session of Congress. And he, he does that in his first term, which is even Bush visited in the second term. And I think the relationship really starts flowering or in some sense strategically in a strategic sense in the second term of Obama. When you have the monumental visit in terms of being the chief guest of the Republic Day celebrations, and one thing I was missing was that I think the heart of the partnership has really been the defense partnership, right? So the defense framework that was there during the Bush administration was taken forward during the Obama administration, and people like Aston Carter, right, who became the defense secretary, has always known to be close to the strategic and the policy making circles in Delhi, and the so-called Defense Threat and Technology Initiative, the DTTI, really gained ground in terms of looking at the threat side of the defense partnership, and also the side of technology sharing between the two countries. Right. So it is said that it was called DTI, and Indians used to call it as Defense Technology Initiative, and Americans used to call it as Defense Threat Initiative. So you could see the priority from both the sides. We are interested in taking technology; they are interested in selling things to us. So threat and technology. So somehow that was brought together, and it was called DTTI, so that it served the interests of both the parties, right? So I think this defense partnership was taken forward during Obama administration as well. The number and the quality and the sophistication of weapons purchase and defense purchases has improved manifold over the period of time, and with the signing of all the foundational agreements right now, I think a certain ground has been covered. Also in terms of like licensing between the two countries, where again the Commerce Department and other things come in. So it's really an interagency sort of a process, right? The whole procuring of defense purchases from each countries and all those things. So in that dimension, I think the relationship has really gone forward. Another dimension is the military to military interoperability exercises. The number as well as the sophistication of the exercises have grown again over the years. We just had the Malabar exercise where Australia joined for the first time. Uh, the level of exercise between the two countries, specifically on anti-submarine warfare capability, has increased over the years, which is really requirement in the Indian Ocean region. So I think in that sense, there has been a larger continuity to the Obama administration from the Bush administration. And I used to always have this, imagine this, that when Obama came as the chief guest of the Republic Day celebrations, and as he stands and then salutes the coming of the show of Indian defense equipment, and he sees a number of Russian equipment coming down the parade, and I think that Obama would be thinking that the next time a US president comes and becomes a chief guest, we would want to see more American equipment going down the line rather than Russian equipment going down the line. So I think that really brings another dimension of the Russian angle, of course, which is something that we need to balance. And in some sense, that has been done over a period of time in terms of buying of the S-400, prime missiles and all those things from Russia. So I believe that the strategic dimension with the Asia rebalancing strategy, of course, when Leon Panetta came to India in 2012 and said that India was, or more specifically, saying that India-US defense cooperation was a linchpin of the Asia rebalancing strategy. I think there was a lukewarm response from New Delhi because we somehow didn't want to be a linchpin to anyone's else strategy, right? So, but with the coming of like the Indo-Pacific and all those things, where India sees a much more central role for itself, that I think uh, there has been a much more receptive sort of an audience as far as Indo-Pacific is concerned. And last but not the least, about the Obama administration, I think it's important to note again that in 2015, when he came, they also signed a joint statement on Asia Pacific and the Indian Ocean region, which is as good as saying the Indo-Pacific, right? So I think, yeah. So I think that on a larger sort of a thing, despite all the hesitation, we also need to sort of point out that during the later phases of the Obama administration, you have a change of guard in India, and a very significant change of guard in India, with a kind of like a wind that wasn't seen in a long time, and the coming of the Modi administration in India, and with all the hesitations that was there, the first visit of Prime Minister Modi to the United States, at least in public diplomacy terms, really being a success. Also leading to joint editorial articles between Obama and Modi in U.S. American newspapers, right? So I think this somehow proves my contention to a large extent that maybe this is because of my own prejudices and subjective sort of orientations of being grounded more on a realist sort of an argument. Just I tend to believe that the structure has an overriding impact on the relationship, which allows the change of guard in both the countries to really being a non-factor to a large extent. I'm not saying that it's not a factor. I'm just saying that it doesn't. It has not really impacted the relationship in the negative direction, despite many hesitations in the change of guard in both the countries.
I would actually say the structure has helped with the rise of populism across the world. And I think it's debatable, but I think I would argue that both Modi and Trump, in that sense, are both populist leaders. And so I think that sort of helped their relationship, right? When you have Prime Minister Modi going to Texas and saying "Ab ki baar Trump sarkar," foreign policy aside, I think when you look at sort of the structure, it helps the leadership of both countries to have that sort of relationship. Which brings me to Trump and the last 4 years of US-India relations. I think, as far as my reading of it goes, is that it's been difficult for India to navigate how to prioritize themselves as high on Trump's list, because Trump had set agendas that he wanted. He had things that he'd said in the run up to his elections, about China, about North Korea, and he went through with those. So, how do you see the change from Obama to Trump and your assessment of the last 4 years?
See, I think as far as the Trump, presidency is concerned, I see that the more deep impact of the presidency has been felt more one on the American domestic scene of, the socio-economic scene or the political scene inside the United States. Uh, there has been deep impact on that aspect in terms of how somewhere you see a more politically sort of polarized American electorate to a large extent, and repercussions of all of that, which you can see in American streets and the political debate as such. I see also the impact happening more on America's traditional alliance partners, in the sense that when you have an alliance partnership, there are certain set parameters of obligations and expectations from both the sides. And there are certain things that you get used to as alliance partners over a period of time, right? And somewhere, I think that relationship, that idea of somewhere looking at alliance partnerships and its terms of engagement as somehow preordained in nature, I think it started changing even before Trump. That's what I was trying to argue, that um, the nature of geopolitics, the nature of the peer competitor that America was apparently facing in the form of China, also somewhat changed the terms of engagement between America's traditional allies and partners, right? So, unlike during the Cold War, there is, at least on the American side, you have a Cold War era set of Asia Pacific alliances and transatlantic alliances. And somehow there are certain, let's say, there's a certain set patterns in that terms of engagement. And I think both the Asian allies as well as the European allies were in for some introspection of how these terms of engagement was somehow changing, not fundamentally sort of like abrogating anything of that sense, but somewhere because of their own engagements with the so-called rising hegemon or the peer competitor, it was bound to change. This was not the Soviet Union. This was a China uh, whose economic influence or whose economic engagements with the whole of Europe and the European Union at large is certainly dramatically different, right? It is the kind of China whose whole culturally or which overriding influence culturally, socially, economic sense, and in some cases even in terms of military partnerships, and in some cases influencing the rebel groups in some countries, like at least in Southeast Asia, and more so with the coming of BRI, reimagining connectivity in a way which has not been done before, right? The Americans are not used to this. Right? The Americans have never faced a peer competitor of this sort, right? In the economic sense, mostly, right? American foreign assistance is not of the nature in which we see in China. Americans somehow, I think, don't understand the Chinese nature of foreign aid and assistance to some extent, where they are building roads, railways, doing all kind of things, and then you have a very very different structure and operations of American aid and assistance, which is somewhat different from. So I think Washington itself is coming to terms with the mechanizations of Beijing. What's really going on here, right? And what is the response, right? What is the response in terms of a American response,
Mm-hmm.
and what is the response in terms of a concerted response with other partners, which might be your traditional allies and which might be new partners that you have built, right? Now, when you build new partners, they're not going to behave like your traditional ally partners, right? And India somehow falls into that category
Mm-hmm.
also, right? Despite all the going close that we are saying, the way you deal with India is not going to be the way you deal with other European countries or with Japan or South Korea, even, right? So you have even a country like Vietnam, with which America is dealing in a very different way now. So what I see is that this change was already happening. It was happening during the Bush administration. It was happening certainly during the Obama administration. You know,
Mm-hmm.
where when you talk to Southeast Asian scholars now and put across this question of China and US, depending on the country that you are talking, right? It might be Malaysia, you might find a different voice. Thailand, you might find a different voice. Myanmar, you find a different voice. So, despite the ASEAN centrality, you should really break it down and talk about this idea of the balancing game, which is really happening. It's really complicated, right? it's really complicated in terms of the ambiguity of the answers that you get from Southeast Asia also, right? Uh, the ASEAN has a voice, but then there is a different sort of mechanics of balancing and bandwagoning, hedging, the limitations of hedging itself, right? If many of the Southeast Asian countries have been balancing between the US and China, what are the limitations of balancing after a point of time? For the Chinese, I think they're going to make it more and more difficult, right? To balance, right? And the Americans are trying to, somehow sustain their own primacy in that area uh, by understanding this new power game. So I think we can, I mean, like we can debate on about like how Trump's presidential style and his lack of strategic acumen and the nature of his team and the whole sort of like instability in terms of the domestic milieu in America and how he deals with partners and other things has affected this entire process, right? Uh, may have accentuated it in some sense. I don't know, right? Uh, but I think from a larger question of undercurrents of foreign policy and geopolitics, I feel that the Trump phenomena or the Trump era would be studied as an era in terms of how it impacted this larger undercurrent of geopolitics, not in terms of Trump having brought this undercurrent of geopolitics, no, because many of these things is a byproduct of new powers which you are not used to dealing with in a way you have dealt with other powers in the past, and the ability of that new power and its terms of engagement with your own allies and partners, right? So America is not going to be able to go to every European country and say that, okay, you deal with China in this way, I will deal with. So that's not going to happen. The European Union is not going to take it beyond a point. The French or the Germans, they're going to deal with China in their own ways, right? Unless and until China becomes a survival threat to them. So the way the Europeans look at Russia or the Soviet Union as America's peer competitor vis-a-vis threat to Europe, I think it's going to be a little different from how the Europeans would want to see China through the American lens or through the European lens or through their own country's sort of lenses. And I think there is something that's going to be very interesting for scholars like us to sort of look ahead in terms of what is the future of power in the Indo-Pacific? What is the future of American power in Indo-Pacific, right? Vis-a-vis the China's power in Indo-Pacific. And that's what I was contending, that America was dealing with a power which is very different from the Soviet Union, which is very different in the kind of materials that it can provide to other countries, which might be America's own partners. It's only, I think it's because of the aggression at the LSE and the whole pandemic situation that we have developed a much harsher sort of stance towards China. And there is seems to be a public goal sort of moving closer to US and teaching China a lesson, this and that. But I don't know, is this a phase? Is it going to continue? I have often asked a lot of people that when we went into Wuhan and the summit, not the Wuhan virus, but the Wuhan summit. But when we went into the Wuhan summit, the first informal summit, and one of the major takeaway is the strategic guidance provided to the two militaries of the two countries. And then you had Mamallapuram, and then you have the LSE problem, right? So I often ask, and I haven't got a clear answer, that what was this strategic guidance? What was this strategic guidance given to the two militaries, and then how did the strategic guidance come to this, right? So I think because of the times that we are in, there in Washington and in many European countries, in Canberra, in New Delhi, there is a much more harsher sort of tone and approach towards dealing with so-called the China challenge. But I don't know like how sustainable is this in real policy and in real sort of operationalization of what to do to China, right? How to deal with China. How are the Southeast Asian countries going to deal with China, right? Are they going to behave in the way the Americans want them to behave? No, I think that's the crux. I think that and that question about the future of not only the conceptualization of power, but also the operationalization of power and the leverage of power in the Indo-Pacific is something which predates Trump, and then which will be a follow-up question even after Trump, leaves the scene, right? So I think at the end, I again sort of re-emphasize that the problem of dealing with China, the problem of dealing with depleting American power. I will not use the word declining. The problem with dealing with depleting American power, and how can you make up for that depletion in your power and influence by making new partners? And what are those? How are those new partners going to gain in the same process? No, if it is a give and take. Uh, I think these questions are much more enduring, and Trump will be studied as a phase in this larger undercurrent. Did it lead to more depletion of American resources, not only in the material terms, but also in the terms of America as a country image, in the terms of the currency of American diplomacy, right? So what his administration did, to that, I think that is going to be a much more important theme to study. Uh, but despite that, I think many of the things is just a follow up on the channels of communication and the channels of the terms of engagement between India and US during the Trump administration. I don't think it is dramatically different from any of the preceding administration. In a very, you can see all of that. But I think the larger undercurrent and the terms of engagement hasn't really shifted or hasn't really changed in the Trump administration, and that's how I see, you know go taking it forward also, right?
Yeah, I understand and I agree with you on several points. I think there are a lot of people who argue, for example, that what would this mean in terms of America's position in the world, in terms of its predominance, right? And there are a lot of people questioning that. And I always joke that, for us in India or for many of us in third world countries in that sense, we are used to politicians who make a fool of themselves. We are used to politicians sort of espousing rhetoric and then not following it up with anything, or seeing the clear contradictions of what politicians say and do in a very real way every single day of our lives. But for America, with all of its sort of moral beliefs in being the land of the free and the home of the brave, and really
Hmm.
buying into that narrative, there was a huge, if I may say, loss of face for themselves. And I think this was also reflected in the way countries around the world saw them, because what does it mean for your narrative if your own politicians are behaving
Hmm.
in a particular way?
Hmm.
um,
Hmm.
so that is one part of, I think,
Hmm.
would be interesting to analyze what the Trump phenomenon has meant for America's image. The other part of it is, I think, a lot of people have argued that Joe Biden going forward from January onwards is going to have to continue some of the things that Trump started. Perhaps a harsher line on China would be something that he would have to continue, because Trump might no longer be the president, depending on how he sees it. But there are voices that echoed his policy on China,
Hmm.
on trade, and in several strands of foreign policy. And so those are not going to be voices that are easy to ignore. What do you make of sort of the challenges that face the Biden presidency?
First of all, I'd like to comment on what you were saying about the theatrics of American politics, right? Maybe it's because of, let's say, the power of American diplomacy or public diplomacy, more particularly, or their propaganda machineries, or just the overriding sort of way in which American culture shifts in so many ways. I think the issue with Trump phenomena is, I'm not trying to give positive points to Trump here, but I'm just saying that when we look at Trump as kind of the nadir of American sort of politics and all of that, I feel that sometimes we tend to sort of like, let's say, what over idealize the American political scene, right? The American democracy, right? And as I said, maybe it is because of the way it has been projected, the image that they have projected of themselves as this exceptional country. So every time something happens like this, uh, their own people as well as our people from outside tend to question the nature of that exceptionalism and say that, okay, is this exceptional, right? So I think that is the reason of that. But sometimes, when you re-look at American politics over a period of time, you see that Trump is one of a kind, but you see that there have been theatrics of American politics before as well. And my contention is that you never know. Trump will be not the end of, like, a Trump-like politics in America, right? So, as I said, even in American politics, you need to see somewhere the undercurrents of why Trump came in the first place, right? What led to sort of Trump coming and winning that election, despite everyone sort of saying that, okay, it's kind of an entertainment. He's not going to last in the nomination rounds also, but somehow he ended up becoming the 45th. And even as I was talking to some friends in the US, and then the response that came to me was like, well, Biden is going to win, but it's unfortunate that the fight is too tight, right? So they were already sort of being a little sort of, not very satisfied with the fact that Trump had to win so many votes in the US, despite everything that's happening around. So I think the thing for outside spectators of American politics would be to temper our expectations a little bit from the from the sanity of American politics, right? In that way, we would be a little sort of guarded in terms of what to expect from American politics and how to measure it vis-a-vis, like, uh, the what we consider as, like, democracy can never be sanitized, right? That's the feature of democracy. But there are certain expectations, and we are right. When, as someone who has studied American politics, when I run into people who don't study it as a profession, the first thing they're gonna ask me is like, "What's happening to America?" Right? So, is this America? Right? So that question comes from already a certain perception or an image or something that they have in their mind of America, and then when they see something like that, they ask someone that is, what is happening there, right? So I think for non-American viewers of American politics, I think the point is to temper our expectations a little bit of what to expect from American politics. Dirtier mechanics of politics have happened in American politics in the last many years of its existence, which, when compared to what is happening now, uh, if not more, it's equally problematic, right? So, in terms of, I think, the Biden foreign policy challenges, I believe that the challenges mostly would be coming again on different levels. Of course, the great power challenge always is going to be the Indo-Pacific theater, and the reason as to why there is this debate about, again, the debate really depends on, when you have this debate about whether Biden will go soft on China or go easy on China or go as hard as it has been right now on China. What is going to be the tone and tenor, and that competition, that confrontation, that contestation, will be a feature of the relationship, and that's a larger undercurrent of great power competition. The larger question is really about, like, how the Biden administration is going to deal with China in the best way, for instance, to temper what is now being called as Chinese growing aggressiveness or whatever it is, right? So in that sense, a lot of countries have a stake in that. in terms of how America deals with China. So it really depends, I think, on where you are looking at it from. Are you looking at it from New Delhi? So from New Delhi, the debate will be different. Okay, what we expect Biden to do with China, right? Uh, I don't know what is the contention in Moscow right now. Okay, what is Biden going to do with China, right? So likewise, uh, in Europe, for instance, you might have a different version or a different debate about what Europe expects Biden how to deal with China, and most importantly, in East Asia and Southeast Asia, in those countries, what is the expectation from the Biden administration about how it is going to deal with China? And you mix all of that with like what the American debate is about how to deal with China, right? So you're going to have a DC debate about how to deal with China, and then you are going to have a larger sort of like spread across, cross university Ivy League tower debate about how to deal with China, right? And then you have a larger public debate about like, okay, what is China, and and that is not going to go much further from much further than talking about like Chinese apps and the economic side of the debate and all those things. So I think it's anyone's guess in terms of what is really going to be the tone and tenor. And although the larger undercurrent is that of a very complex relationship that mixes competition and contestation and confrontation, all of that, right? All of that. So, which one is going to sort of like, at least during the pandemic, there is a lot of writing which says that it's going to turn more confrontational, right? Including so from now on, I think as we move ahead, the relationship is going to be quite sort of not very different, but it will be, I think, important to watch out for like which parts of the C's, whether the competition, the confrontation, the contestation, and also the cooperation, right? How do they sort of play out each other, and which part, if confrontation C was more prominent during the pandemic in a region, in a world which is going towards sort of moving ahead from in a not really in a post-pandemic, but really about opening and all those things, and reimagining relationships altogether again. Which C is going to be more prominent in this relationship? I think that's something that we should watch out for. The other prominent thing, of course, would be Iran, right? In terms of how the Biden administration will deal with Iran, will it? I mean, I don't believe that it could be or he has the bandwidth to really take it back to the JCPOA era or the Obama era kind of diplomacy, because we also have to consider the fact that after during the Trump administration, a lot of water has flown down the river in terms of what has happened in Iran as well, with Soleimani's assassination, all these things happening. So to expect that just because you have a change of heart and a change of administration in Washington, you can somehow magically sort of like fly back to the previous era and start from that uh, patch of diplomacy, and undoing the 4 years of dynamics that has happened during the Trump administration has had an impact on the other side also, right? In terms of the dynamics between the so-called hardliners and the liberals in Iran. So I don't think he would have the political leverage, even if he had won in DC, he won't have that in vis-a-vis Iran, uh, or for that matter, other countries, right? China is an important player in that. Russia is an important player in that, right? Apart from the other European countries. So it's not just a question of Biden wanting to do certain things, right? It's it's a question of what will be the limitations in him trying to do what he wants to do, right? Even if he wanted the relationship to start from like a certain point, whether he will have the leverage to take it to that point, because it's not just him wanting to do something. It is also what has been how dynamics has changed in the other actors over this last 4 years, right? So I think that's going to be a major sort of uh, policy sort of a thing to watch out for, because that relationship is going to have an impact on our own choices in India as well. Because one of the I contend that like there is a cost to be paid in any choice that we make in our lives. There is a cost to be paid when countries make choices. Now, that cost is not necessarily in the term of money or anything. That cost is in the terms of engagement with other countries.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when we make the choice of going closer to the US, we cannot expect that people in Moscow will be sitting and then clapping their hands and say, wow, like go together, we rejoice, right? Neither people is sitting in Tehran would just sort of look at it and say, great thing, like you guys become friends. Like, so I think there is going to be a course in our relationship with some other countries. I think it's just a matter of, are we ready to incur the cost? You know,
Mm.
are we ready for that? Right? We cannot, for example, make a decision, make a choice, and then later on say that, well, I was not expecting this to happen, right? In
Mm.
Tehran or in Moscow. When you make choices, then certain other things will happen in other parts of the world. And
Mm.
it's just a matter of like, have we taken those costs into consideration, right? So how Biden deals with Iran is going to be very important. Another, I think, foreign policy, although I don't know much about the really specifics of how it is going to be taken forward, but the appointment of John Kerry as the climate change envoy, and
Mm.
how the Biden administration again is going to sort of undo certain things, right? That's the crux part. How do you undo things
Mm.
after 4 years of another administration? And then how do you take into consideration that because of a certain decision that was made in Washington some years back, that would have had impact on other countries' perception of you also. So how are
Mm.
you going to like sort of pull it back, no, and move it in a different direction, right? The other thing is Afghanistan. Last but not the least, Afghanistan. And it's an interesting thing to look for, because Biden, when he was the vice president, he was one of those guys who was not really on board with Obama's search and exit policy. He always, in his interviews that he gave way back in 2011, I think in Newsweek or something, he had, I think, made it very clear that his preference was more of a reconciliation plus counterterrorism approach with a leaner force presence, which was required in Afghanistan.
Mm.
So, given the uncertainties in terms of the withdrawal process, the pull-out process, and also the communication with other NATO forces, right? And the what 4,500 or something forces which are there, how they, there has been a lot of voices about like, pull out before Christmas, this and that,
Mm.
so we're not really sure. In the midst of that, you have an intra-Afghan talks, which is equally treacherous, more treacherous, in fact. And there is a lot of voices from within the Afghan administration which are calling out to the Biden administration to undo some of the things which was done as a partner agreement in Qatar, which did
Mm.
not involve the Afghan government. So I don't think the Biden administration is going to really listen to the Afghan voices which are telling him to like scrap the peace agreement and redo it again. I don't foresee that. I foresee the peace agreement as still being a frame of reference
Mm.
of what is going to be American policy in Afghanistan. So in many ways, the dice has been rolled in Afghanistan,
Mm.
and it's a matter of like how a person who was more inclined towards a reconciliation plus small, leaner counterterrorism approach in Afghanistan is going to approach Afghanistan as the 46th president of the US. Is he going to be different? How is he going to take up from where Trump left?
Mm.
Um, and that is really important, because that's going to have repercussion in terms of regional security environment, repercussions in terms of what is the future of US-Pakistan relationship is going to be in some sense, and what is the future of India's presence in Afghanistan is going to be, right? So that those I think are some of the foreign policy challenges which I feel is ones which have some kind of relevance as far as India-US relations is concerned.
Fair enough. And after that huge sort of expose in, I think we've covered tremendous ground in the last hour and a half or so. And it makes me wonder, if someone wants to read more about Indo-US relations, what books or resources would you suggest for them?
There's a problem of plenty right now. If you take in all the commentaries and pieces which come out very regularly on India, US, and things related to that. So I will not talk about those ones. You can always, people who want to study, if you have a social media connection, whether you like it or not, you will be popped by commentaries and pieces written on this aspect. But really, from as I started the conversation with you, Hamsini, about history, and I think it's really important for someone who wants to understand this relationship to have a strong historical background of the relationship. So, uh, when I started doing my PhD on the Lyndon Johnson era, and I would go around and proudly tell people, you know what, I'm working on Lyndon Johnson. And people will look at me and say that, what are you doing working on 1960s? That would be the response from people uh, who were in the strategic environment sometimes, and they were more. It was more of like what's happening currently, what's happening presently. But I believe that the seeds of what's happening now has been shown many years before, right? Of both the challenges as well as the opportunities of the relationship, and it's that's why it's really important. And there are many books which refer to India-US relations in some sense or the other. I will again not talk about those. Then there will be a long list. Uh, there is a very fascinating work by M.S. Venkatramani and B.K. Srivastava. M.S. Venkatramani was the one who started the American Studies program in the School of International Studies in JNU. So he and V.K. Srivastava wrote this book, Quick India, the American Response to the 1942 Struggle. A very interesting work to really build a ground mapping of like the beginning of the early stages of the relationship, even before India became independent, right? And the building of perceptions from then on, of an America who had fought the British and who were all for self-determination and all those things. But when it really came down to supporting India vis-a-vis the British, did they really measure up? These are important questions to ask, right? Uh, from a very chronological point of view, Dennis Cook's work on India and the U.S. estranged democracies, uh, at least till during about the Cold War period, it still remains the most go-to book for beginners in of the study to understand it from a chronological point of view, presidents to presidents. Harold Gold and Sumit Ganguly has this collection of works on U.S.-India relations from Roosevelt to Reagan. Again, shed certain light. One of the fascinating American works on India-U.S. relations, but also on the larger U.S.-South Asia sort of a thing, policy or strategy, is written by a professor from Ohio State University, Robert J. McMahon. It's called A Cold War on the Periphery, the U.S., India, and Pakistan. Again, it's a historical work which stops somewhere in the 60s, but it's really an interesting work, sets the groundwork. You there's a professor in University of Texas at Austin, historian H.W. Brands, who wrote this book, India and the United States, The Cold Peace. Again, a historical work. Professor Chintamani Mahapatra from JNU has written this very important work on Indo-US relations into the 21st century. It's a very important work on the post-Cold War phase, from the starting of the opening of the economy and what really happens as a postscript. Uh, he has the nuclear test and the response, so it's covering most of like the Cold War period. The book that I mentioned by Strop Talbot, Engaging India, is also an account of the talks that happened. Teresa Schaffer, again a former ambassador has this book on India and the US in the 21st century. Again, more of a contemporary phase of the relationship, looking at those aspects. Shi Raja Mohan's two important books on Impossible Allies, which talks about the nuclear aspect and India-US relations, and also his work on Indian foreign policy, which is Crossing the Rubicon. Although it's not an India-US relations book, it has a very important section on trying to analyze the turning of India towards the West and the building of the new relationship between India and the United States. So, in that sense, it's a very good book. Bruce Riedel's work on JFK's Forgotten Crisis. So, as the name suggests, JFK's Forgotten Crisis talks about the 1962 war. Among the new ones, very recent book by Tanvi Madan on the Fateful Triangle, how China shaped the US-India relation. It's an archive-based, good historical and also a contemporary mapping of the role, the factor of China in India-US relations. Rudra Chaudhary had written a book called Forts in Crisis, which is also a good work on India-US relations. So there are many. These are some of the solid works on the relationship. As I said, there are many, many books which refers to the relationship as a part of the larger sort of book. But for all of those who start looking at the relationship and want to have a taste of online archives on the relationship, there are many, in fact. The most resourceful is the Foreign Relations of the United States, which you can refer to through the Office of Historian. So it's an online archive that gives you access president by president, and you need to it's a painstaking process to look at all the telegrams and everything that are part of this relationship that shape the nature of this relationship. But I think very, very solid sort of resource. Then you have the presidential libraries of all the US presidents. Some of them are very, very accessible online. They have many of their documents which have been digitized. Some of them are in the process of doing so. So you might find them a little short on digitized documents, but many of them have access to digitized documents. The National Security Archives regularly come out with very good collection of documents on any relationship of the US foreign policy, and India-US is one of them. So you can also access all of them. All of these libraries are very, very, very accessible, and they are very responsive the moment you write to their archivist. And you might find some difficulties because of the pandemic situation, but at any regular point of time, they are quick to respond to your mails and are very good in terms of guiding you through the availability of resources and other things. So, that should do for now.
Thank you so much, sir, for that extensive reading list, but also for coming on the podcast. I'm really, really happy that you came on the show today and we got to do this.
Thank you, Hamsini, and the pleasure was absolutely mine. And I enjoyed, the much probing questions that you put to me that allowed me to sort of think aloud, think about many things that I didn't, I thought before, but maybe I never had to answer to anyone. and the fact that I had to answer to you, to your questions, made me think more aloud. And I think the pleasure is absolutely mine in terms of having this opportunity to think more on a subject that I chose to be my bread and butter for a lifetime. And I think this will only provide me an opportunity to think further and come up with more questions and more insights into this relationship. So thank you for providing me this opportunity, and it was a real delight to talk things related to US and foreign policy and India-US relations on a beautiful Sunday morning.
Awesome. That brings us to the end of this episode of States of Anarchy. Thank you for staying with us till the end. Dr. Munish's recommendations are in the episode bio, so I do recommend checking those out. If you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to reach out to me at HamsiniH on Twitter and at States of Anarchy on Instagram. States of Anarchy would not be possible without the kind folks at the Takshashila Institution and the independent public-spirited Media Foundation. And finally, thank you, dear listener, for tuning in week after week and for being so kind and considerate with your feedback and reviews. If you want to help us reach more people, please leave us a rating on iTunes. You can listen to States of Anarchy not only on the IVM podcast app and website, but on Spotify, iTunes, Gaana, Google Podcasts, or whatever you're using right now. Our next episode is on December 22nd with General Asad Durrani. Till then, stay safe, stay healthy.
Advertising is dead. Yep, you heard me right. Advertising is dead. We're all in the content business now. Let's not call it news, TV, radio, etc., etc. It's all content, and we're in the middle of this weirdly exciting phase where all the borders and lines that have been drawn over decades has been swept away by this lovely thing called the internet. We're a show where we don't dwell on just the stuff that is now, but rather the wider stuff about advertising, media, content, and the whole goddamn circus surrounding it. Tune in every Tuesday for our weekly unboxing of the mystery box we used to call advertising. I'm Varun Dugirala, co-founder and content chief at The Glitch, and this is my new podcast, Advertising is Dead.
Beta, did you know 79% of all scientists in NASA are Indian only?
देखो, इंडिया में टैक्स सिर्फ मिडिल क्लास भरती है. Everyone is just enjoying free यार.
आजकल के youngsters are only interested in partying and enjoying. उनको देश की पड़ी ही नहीं है.
बेटा तुम बस शादी कर लो, उसके बाद तो you can enjoy life like anything.
I will tell you what this country needs. This country needs 15 years of dictatorship. That is the only way to become a superpower. See the Chinese, how much they've progressed.
सुनो, तुमने ये WhatsApp forward देखा?
So what's common between all of these statements?
They're all absolutely rubbish.
Fake WhatsApp forwards that spread like wildfire.
And statements that defy any logic.
They are here to debunk them all.
Way of family WhatsApp groups, worst nightmare. Where what happens when you read a book.
Basically, we're just a bunch of guys who want to cut through the bullshit of everyone saying this, how it won't be true.
So that the next time someone confidently squeezes out some WhatsApp or Twitter BS, you can look them dead in the eye and go, Uncle, please sit.
So join me, Joel.
And me, Tushar.
Every Mondays for a fresh new episode of Uncle, Please Sit.